The knock came just after midnight, soft at first, like someone unsure if they had the right house or the right to disturb a soul who had asked the world for nothing. Ellen stood motionless in her kitchen, one hand still wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, the other trembling slightly as it hovered near the drawer where her husband's pocketknife used to be. There were no screams, no gunshots, no sounds from the woods, just the quiet knock again, firmer now, like a decision had been made on the other side of the door. She opened it without speaking, without breathing, and there he stood, Sheriff Ellis, hat in hand, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched like he was holding back something sharp enough to slice his own tongue in two. "Ellen," he said slowly, like her name was a fragile thing he'd just dropped. "It's David. There's been an incident." Not a pause. Not a question. Not a word more than what was needed. And behind him, in the back of the patrol car, sat Greta, her fur matted with something darker than mud, her flank trembling, her eyes locked on Ellen like she'd run through hell to get back to her. She couldn't yet know that Greta had been found alone, 12 miles north of any place she'd ever dared to wander, standing guard beside something the sheriff wouldn't name until the forensics team arrived. She had no idea that David Hobson, the only man who had visited her since Hank died, the one who once sat at her kitchen table and cried into his coffee about the son he hadn't seen in 20 years, was already in custody. She had no idea that Greta had led searchers directly to a buried cache that was never meant to be found, a cache filled with children's shoes, dog tags, and a rusted camera that still held a story no one was ready to believe. The sheriff didn't step inside. He just placed a folded piece of paper on the porch rail and said, "I didn't want you to hear it from anyone else." He confessed. Then he turned and walked back to his cruiser like every step away from her was an escape from the guilt he didn't want to wear anymore. Greta didn't move until Ellen whispered her name, and even then, the dog only limped forward like each paw carried a different story, some too old, some too heavy, all of them unfinished. The paper in Ellen's hand was shaking, not because of the words, but because of the signature at the bottom. David Hobson. It was my brother. I helped him cover it up. I didn't kill them. But I knew. And I let it happen. Her knees buckled before she made it back inside, but Greta was already there, beneath her, beside her, not making a sound, just watching the door like the knocking might return. Ellen sat there for hours, surrounded by silence that didn't feel silent at all, until the sun began to rise behind the pines. And then she whispered it, not to the sheriff, not to David, not to the memory of her husband who might have known more than he ever said, but to the dog that had walked back from hell just to lay her head in Ellen's lap. "What else did you see, girl?" She didn't see it. "I did," said the voice, gruff and low, rising from the shadows of Ellen's porch like something left behind too long. She didn't see him at first, didn't recognize the man until he stepped into the yellow spill of the porch light, where his face looked older, harder, and less human than it ever had when he helped her fix the roof last fall. It was Lloyd Rayner, the groundskeeper from the old church cemetery, the same man who buried her husband 2 years back, the same man who always nodded with that quiet, southern dignity like the world still meant something, even when it didn't. "I saw the girl," he said again, not blinking, his cap pressed to his chest like he was about to deliver a eulogy no one asked for and everyone needed. "She ran past me that morning near the North Trail, barefoot, screaming for someone who wasn't chasing her, not yet, anyway." Ellen stood frozen in the doorway, one hand still curled around Greta's collar, the other clenched around the letter David Hobson had signed, the words beginning to rot in her mind like fruit left too long on a grave. Lloyd stepped closer, and Greta didn't growl, didn't flinch, didn't look away, and that alone kept Ellen from running back inside to lock the door like instinct screamed she should. "I thought she was playing," he said, his voice cracking like a branch giving way in winter, or maybe running from a fight, or a boy, or something stupid like teenagers do before the world ever really breaks them. Then he pulled something from his coat pocket, and even before he opened his weathered hand, Ellen knew it would be bad, knew it would carry a weight that couldn't be buried like the others. It was a child's shoelace, frayed and knotted with dirt, still stiff with something dark along the ends, the kind of relic that doesn't get lost but left, maybe torn in struggle, maybe worse. "I found it the next day behind the fence line," he said, barely louder than the wind. And when I told Sheriff Ellis, he told me to forget it. Greta shifted then, just slightly, like the word sheriff pulled something tight inside her, and Ellen, for the first time, looked down and noticed the stitches along the dog's ribs, new and clumsy, like they hadn't come from a vet. She couldn't yet know that Greta had been patched up by a stranger in a cabin 10 miles past where maps stopped naming places, and where law had no meaning anymore. She had no idea that Lloyd Rayner wasn't just the man who tended graves but had once worn a badge himself, long before his wife died and took the last of his faith with her. She had no idea that Greta had once been trained not just for tracking, but for search and protection, a police dog, retired and discarded, who'd smelled blood long before Ellen ever heard a knock at her door. I know where she ran from, Lloyd said, his hand still open, still holding that damn shoelace like it was a ticket to hell. I just never had the courage to follow. Ellen stared at him then, saw the years pressed into his shoulders like the weight of every grave he'd ever dug, and for one sharp second, she wanted to scream at him, wanted to curse him for waiting so long, for letting it rot, for saying it now when it was already too late. But she didn't scream. She just looked at Greta, who stared into the woods like she already knew the way. And finally, Ellen whispered, "Then where do we start?" "We start with the names carved under the chapel floor," Lloyd said, and before Ellen could ask why, he was already moving. They crossed the churchyard in silence, passing crooked stones and rusted gates, the wind curling through broken glass and choked weeds like something trying to speak but choking on its own history. Inside, the air smelled of pine rot and wet paper, of sermons long since silenced and sins that had never been confessed, at least, not in ways heaven would recognize. Lloyd knelt behind the pulpit without a word, pulled back a warped wooden panel like a man who'd done it too many times in his mind, and pointed to the beams beneath. Ellen stepped closer, heart thudding like it was trying to get out, and there they were, scratched deep into the old floorboards, uneven and angry, the way children write when their hands are shaking too hard to finish. There were 4 names. 2 were unfamiliar, just first names, Lacey and Tommy, no last initials, no dates, just left there like whispers that never found a voice. The 3rd name hit harder. April M. A name Ellen hadn't heard in over 30 years, not since the summer a little girl with red pigtails and skinned knees vanished from the north woods without leaving so much as a shoelace behind. But the 4th name was the one that stopped the world from turning. Danny Hobson. Ellen didn't say a word. She just looked at Lloyd, who looked back like he'd finally said the thing he thought he'd never say. "He didn't run away," Lloyd said, voice low and steady, like a man speaking over a grave. "That's what they told the papers. That's what his daddy told the town." Ellen felt the room tilt, not from surprise but from the weight of how many people must have known, how many chose silence instead of questions, comfort instead of truth. She couldn't yet know that Danny Hobson had discovered something in that chapel no 12-year-old should ever have to carry, and someone made damn sure he'd never carry it again. She had no idea that April M., the girl lost in 1985, had written a letter to the sheriff's office just 3 days before she disappeared, a letter no one ever filed. She had no idea that Tommy and Lacey had come from the same foster home, a place funded by the same church that now sat empty, cracked, and full of names that wouldn't stay buried. Lloyd ran his hand across the names, slowly, with a tenderness that didn't fit a man who used to carry a badge and a .38 revolver. "I saw David bring his brother here more than once," he said, eyes distant. "Always at night. Always quiet. Sometimes, they left with bags. Sometimes, they came back without them." Ellen felt Greta stir beside her, low and growling, her eyes fixed not on the old man or the names, but on the shadows behind the altar. And then, like something timed with a trigger neither of them could see, a low creak split the silence, floorboards shifting above them, someone moving upstairs. Lloyd didn't flinch. He just whispered, "There's someone else who knew." Ellen backed away, heart hammering so loud it muffled every other sound, and reached for Greta's collar, but the dog was already moving toward the stairs. Someone was up there. Someone who had waited too long to come forward, or too long to be forgiven. Before Ellen could speak, a voice drifted down the stairwell, low, familiar, steady in the way only guilt can make a man steady. "I should have stopped it," it said. "But I was already too far in." "How long have you been lying to me, Sheriff?" Ellen asked, her voice not raised, not broken, but carved from the kind of still fury that could sink a man without ever touching him. Sheriff Ellis stood at the top of the chapel stairs like a man already caught in the act of burying himself, hands still at his sides, hat off, eyes on the floor, not from shame, but from the kind of grief that turns inward until nothing's left but dust and duty. "I didn't lie," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they drooped under their own weight like wet laundry on a broken line. "I just didn't tell you everything." Ellen stepped up one stair, then another, Greta following tight at her heel, silent as judgment and just as sure. "You let him walk free," she said, each word like a nail through years of memory, every cup of coffee shared, every story swapped, every long, quiet afternoon where she thought she wasn't alone. "You let David live among us like a man. You let him pray with us. Eat with us. Hug our children." "I didn't know," Ella said, and for a second, just 1 second, Ellen almost believed him, until he lifted his head and said, "Not until the boy disappeared." That name. That terrible, quiet name no one had spoken in years. "Danny," she said, and the room went still, like the wind itself had stopped to listen. Sheriff Ellis walked past the altar now, slow, like every board might break beneath him, like maybe he wanted it to. "I found the camera," he said. "Buried outside the Hobson place, under a box of rusted tools and empty whiskey bottles. Hadn't been touched in years." Ellen watched his hands shake, just slightly, as he reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth, the same cloth her husband once used for cleaning guns. She took it without hesitation. Inside was an old, scorched roll of film, brittle and dark, but intact, and the look on the sheriff's face told her everything she needed to know. "You had it all this time," she whispered. "You had the truth, and you said nothing." Ellis didn't deny it. Didn't move. He just sat on the front pew like a man waiting for a verdict only God could deliver. "David begged me," he said. "Said his brother was sick. Said he'd stopped. Said there'd be no more. And you believed him." "I wanted to." Greta growled then, a low, constant sound that seemed to rise from the floorboards, from the names scratched below, from the ghosts that no longer stayed quiet. Ellen stepped back, heart pounding so loud it swallowed every other sound, and turned to Lloyd, whose face had gone pale as stone. "You knew too, didn't you?" she asked. "All of you. Every man in this town who told me to let the past rest, you weren't protecting the children. You were protecting each other." Lloyd didn't answer. He didn't have to. But then Ellis looked up, and what he said next tore through the air like a whip across old scar tissue. "There's one more name," he said. "One that wasn't carved. One that was never supposed to come to light." Ellen stared at him, chest tight, pulse a drumbeat of rage and rising panic. "Whose name?" The sheriff swallowed, eyes full of something worse than guilt, fear. "Your husband's." "What the hell did Hank have to do with any of this?" Ellen asked, her voice like gravel under boot, rough, cracked, and louder than it had ever been in years. Sheriff Ellis didn't answer right away, because men like him know there are silences that must be endured like punishment before truth can be spoken aloud. He looked at her like a man remembering something he tried to forget for too long, something he thought would stay dead and buried, like bones under a chapel floor no one prayed over. "Hank was the one who brought the photos to me first," Ellis said, his hands trembling now not from guilt, but from what it cost to carry that secret for half his damn life. "He found that camera while fixing fence posts near the Hobsons' old tool shed, thought it belonged to some dumb teenager sneaking around." Ellen staggered back a step, eyes wide, as the air around her seemed to collapse inward like the center of a fire gone cold. "He developed the film himself," Ellis said. "Didn't trust anybody else. Not with what he saw." Greta let out a low, mournful whine, The kind of sound dogs make when they sense a sorrow too deep to bark at, the kind of sorrow that smells like memory and shame. Ellen shook her head slowly, refusing to believe it, refusing to let that version of Hank, the man who brought her coffee every morning without fail, who built her a porch swing with his bare hands, who cried alone the night their only child was stillborn, be real. He never told me, she whispered, and suddenly her knees didn't feel like they could carry her anymore. Ellis caught her arm, gently, like a man lifting a fallen cross he once helped build. Hank came to me that night, said he didn't know what to do. Said David's brother had been sick for years. Said some of those kids were from out of town, no one would ever come looking. Ellen's breath caught in her throat like barbed wire, cold, tight, and tearing slowly. So he covered it up. No, Ellis said, and for once, there was something almost noble in his voice, something not shaped by fear but by the truth he'd carried like a stone in his chest for decades. He made me swear to go to the feds. Said it had to stop. Said if I didn't, he would. Then why didn't you, she asked, her voice breaking open like a long-sealed letter. Why didn't either of you do something? Ellis stepped away from her, his shadow long against the altar wall, and for the first time since the night Greta came back bloody and silent, Ellen saw the full weight of what had been kept from her. Because Hank died in a fire 2 nights later, Ellis said, and now there were tears in his voice, not on his face, but buried in each word like nails in a coffin. Not an accident. Not lightning. Arson. Quiet. Clean. No trace. Ellen's breath stilled in her lungs. Are you telling me he was murdered? I couldn't prove it, Ellis said, eyes full of ghosts. But I knew. We both knew who lit it. The room spun, the names on the floor beneath her spinning like tombstones on a wheel. And then she remembered something small, something she'd locked away for years like a dull ache she never wanted to pick at. A letter. Still sealed. Found in Hank's toolbox, never mailed, addressed to L. Rayner, with only 3 words scrawled on the back. If they find me. Ellen didn't cry. Didn't scream. She just looked at Ellis, at Greta, at the pews worn down by decades of prayers that never reached heaven, and said the only thing left to say. Then it's time to finish what he started. Ellis nodded once, slow, broken, redeemed, and handed her a key, old and cold, with an iron tag that read. Cabin 7, Northline Ridge. That's where the last piece is, he said. That's where the truth lives. Are you ready for what you're gonna find there? Lloyd asked, his voice stripped of everything but truth and warning, as Ellen placed the iron key into her coat pocket without so much as a flinch. I'm not going there to find something, she answered quietly, her breath frosting in the morning air as Greta pressed against her leg like a silent vow, I'm going there to end it. By the time they reached Northline Ridge, the trees had thinned into sharp silhouettes against a sky the color of bruised steel, the wind slicing through the branches like a whisper carrying names too long buried. Greta was the first to smell it, not fear, not blood, but the scent of old wood and rotted paper, of a place that hadn't been entered in years but had never once stopped watching the world it came from. Ellen pushed open the cabin door with a slow creak that sounded too much like a child's breath before a scream, and inside, the air was colder than outside, like the past itself had sealed this place shut and waited for her return. The floor was covered in dust, thick and undisturbed, except for a single path leading to the far wall, where a trapdoor sat under a rug that didn't belong in any hunting lodge. She didn't ask Greta to go first, but the dog went anyway, nose low, muscles tense, ears forward, the way a soldier moves into a room where someone once died badly. Beneath the trapdoor was a small space, barely tall enough to crawl into, lit by the weak beam of the flashlight Lloyd had pressed into her hand back at the truck. And there, in the dark, she found the things they had all tried to forget, the kind of truth you don't hide because it's evil, but because it's ordinary and it's evil, and that's what makes it so unbearable. A metal box. Inside, baby teeth in envelopes, labeled with names that never made it to school records. Drawings. Ribbons. And in the corner, a folder marked, Volunteers, with photographs of men smiling at picnics, at baptisms, at town meetings. David Hobson was in all of them. So was the sheriff. So was Lloyd. And then, there was Hank. But not like the others. His photo had an X through it, thick and red, like the fire that took him wasn't meant to burn him alive, but to erase him completely. Ellen dropped the folder to the floor, but something else slipped out, a cassette tape, unlabeled, wrapped in a child's mitten. She stared at it for a long time before sliding it into the old tape recorder in the corner, hands shaking not from fear, but from rage now aging into something far colder and more enduring. The tape hissed, then crackled, and then came the voice, David Hobson, calm, quiet, discussing removal, management, and exposure, as though he were reading off a shopping list instead of listing children's names. And then came another voice. Hank. Softer, but clear. You're sick, he said. If you think I'm gonna stay quiet, you don't know me at all. And David's reply, cruel, casual, final. I know you, Hank. That's why I already lit the match. Ellen fell to her knees, not from weakness, but from the kind of sorrow that weighs more than any truth ever should, the sorrow of loving a man who died trying to do the right thing in a town that fed on silence. Greta came beside her and lay down, not because she was tired, but because she knew it was over. The storm didn't come outside. It came inside her. The next day, she turned everything over, the tape, the photos, the box, to a state investigator who didn't ask questions, because the evidence screamed loud enough. David Hobson was arrested, finally, without words, without resistance, just a nod, like a man who'd known this day was always going to come but hoped he'd die before it did. Sheriff Ellis resigned quietly and left town without goodbye. Lloyd didn't run. He stayed. And every Sunday since, he tends the chapel floor where the names were carved, not to forget them, but so no one else will. Greta was given an award by the state, though she never understood what for. She only cared that Ellen took her home afterward and let her sleep in the bed for the first time in her life. Ellen never gave another interview. Never wrote a book. She planted flowers by Hank's grave and one small cedar tree by the trail where Greta first barked at something unseen. And one afternoon, as the light came through the trees just right, she saw them, children, laughing, running, their parents not watching over their shoulders anymore. Safe. At last. And Greta, now gray at the muzzle, lay in the sun with her head on Ellen's foot, as if to say, it's over now. Let's rest.